Okay, and it is 3 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. And as folks continue to filter in, my name is Crystal Colden. I'm at the University of California, Merced, as an assistant professor in management of complex systems, including fire science. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome to our fire science seminar series for a fall of 2020, what we hope will be an ongoing series. Uh, and this is hosted by University of California, Berkeley is providing financial support, website, all the goodies. And this is where you can also find the seminar once, if you've missed past seminars or you want to watch this one again, it's being recorded and it is on the website for the Fire Science Seminar at UC Berkeley. We would also like to thank our partner, California Fire Science Consortium, for helping to get the word out and publicize these seminars. Today, we are going to be hearing a talk from Dr. Sara McAllister, who I will introduce in just a second. Before I do, I wanted to remind all of our participants that you are on mute because this is set up as a Zoom webinar or seminar. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen on the control panel, there is a little Q&A box, and if you please type in your questions there, when we get to the end of the talk, we will go ahead and take some questions for Dr. McAllister. And then we will also, over the course of the seminar, add the link for the discussion that will occur from 4 to 5 p.m., where you can join into the discussion and ask Dr. McAllister additional questions, and in general talk about the cool stuff that she is presenting today. And again, that is from 4 to 5. There is a link in prior emails that you should have gotten if you're on our emailing list. If you're not on the email list, please go ahead and register at the Berkeley website. And the link will also be posted in the chat as we move towards the end of the seminar. So again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. I did notice that someone said there's a lot of background noise like a fan on Sara's line. Yes, that's because there's a background fan in Sara's space that she has no control over. So we are going to all listen very carefully and turn our volume up so that we can hear Sara great today. The challenges of government employees trying to do the best they can with what they are given by their employer. I also would like to mention that our colleagues are putting on a remote sensing and wildland fire symposium. So the slide that's currently up on the screen is an advert for that symposium. They have a whole list of great speakers that are listed on their website. And, you know, not many places where you get to see a bunch of top-notch remote sensing and fire speakers for so little, certainly not at a normal conference. So great opportunity to support ASPRS and listen to the seminars on that series. If you want more information on that, the website is there on the slide. Okay, with that, I will go ahead and actually now introduce our speaker. Dr. Sara McAllister has a PhD in mechanical engineering from UC Berkeley. Sense of theme with mechanical engineering in UC Berkeley and combustion science here. Her doctoral dissertation, however, was on flammability in spacecraft. So I was just asking her if she had to choose space shuttle versus fire. But her doctoral work was funded by NASA, and then since 2009 and finishing her doctorate, she joined the U.S. Forest Service in Missoula at the Fire Science Lab as a research mechanical engineer. She is part of the National Fire Decision Support Center, where she focuses on the fundamental governing mechanisms of wildfire spread. And with that, I'll stop cutting into her time and let her take it away. Thanks, Sara.
Thanks, Crystal. So today I'm going to talk about the fundamental wildland fire research that goes on at the Fire Lab, and kind of give a really high-level overview of a lot of the stuff we do, but then really kind of dive down into some of the work I've been doing about burning rate. So a lot of this work is as part of a team, so that didn't happen in a vacuum. There's a lot of great people that we work with. I've listed many of them here. This is everything from scientists that help brainstorm crazy ideas to machinists that help us build our instruments so that we can actually do the experiments. It includes all the technicians that help us all along the way, statisticians to help us analyze the data, electrical engineers to help us hook up data acquisition centers and all of that. So it's a very big group that we do a lot of work, and none of this happened by ourselves by any means. So just a quick introduction about the Fire Lab if you haven't heard of us. It is formerly known as the Fire, Fuel, and Smoke Science Program with the Forest Service. And in this building, we do research in six different focus areas. There's the Physical Fire Processes group, which I'm a part of. But there's also groups that work on things like fuel dynamics, smoke emissions and dispersion, fire ecology, fire and fuel management strategies, and science of system delivery. So one of the things, among others, that makes us really, truly unique is that we have a really awesome experiment facility. So the very big white building here down in that bottom picture is our burn chamber with the big white ball on top. So it is a 64-foot high, 40-foot square building that's completely climate controlled. That means that we can set the relative humidity between 10 and 100%. We can set the temperature between 50 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And what's really kind of neat about it too is that big burn chamber is a settling chamber for the two wind tunnels that we have, meaning that all of the air that goes into the wind tunnels goes through the burn chamber. So that means that our wind tunnels are also climate controlled. So we have two. The big green one that my colleague is standing in front of right here is our low speed tunnel. It has a 10-foot by 10-foot cross section. You can stand up in it and do some pretty big fires in it. It has a max velocity of 7 miles an hour, which doesn't sound like much, but if you recall that when people talk about wind speeds and the weather, that's measured at like 20-foot height knockdown to the ground. So 7 miles an hour is a pretty stiff wind, and in fact, like when it's running full speed, you can barely close the door. It's pretty good. We also have a high-speed wind tunnel, which is this red one here. That's a 3-foot by 3-foot cross section, and that goes up to 40 miles an hour, which is ridiculously fast, and you can't burn anything with it going that fast. So this is what used to calibrate things and stuff like that. Both of them are pretty long, so you can get a pretty good fuel bed going. So why study fire behavior in the first place? Well, I guess I don't really need to remind anybody in California that every year we seem to get caught off guard by wildland fires, right? And I would argue that a lot of this has to do with the fact that the majority of our first-hand fire experience is with relatively small tame fires. So you and I, might have experience with campfire, but even the normal firefighter doesn't get to deal with these big fires on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the Forest Service still has a 97% initial attack success rate, which means we put out 97% of the fires when they're still very small. So only 3% of all fires grow to be much more than a few acres, and only a very small portion of those grow to be big mega fires that we're dealing with right now. The other thing is that the models and the fire prediction tools that we have were all developed in the lab. That very wind tunnel that I showed you developed the Rothenbull spread equation, which is the basis of all of our operational fire spread models, and that was back in the 60s and 70s. So because they were lab-based experiments, they were really developed for fairly limited conditions in terms of the fire size, the fuel characteristics. I mean, they're done in a wind tunnel, so we meant for windy conditions, and we have to do some fledging and make them work for slopes and stuff like that. But generally, they work pretty well for mild to moderate conditions, but they can't handle things like the big fires that we're seeing now, or threshold behaviors, whether things will spread or will it not, and when it transitions between things. So what we need to be able to do to handle the new normal is understand fire behavior better. And that really is at the fundamental physics level. We need to understand the nitty-gritty bits and pieces, the nuts and bolts of how wildland fire works in order to get any better at dealing with it. So once we do this, this will actually allow us to better train our firefighters so they're not relying on just their first-hand experience with what they've seen, which might be fairly limited in terms of the conditions. We can do more effective planning and mitigation, in particular fuel treatment. We have a lot of kind of rules of thumbs and gut feelings on how we do a lot of things, but not a lot of really solid models and good foundations for how to be able to do those scientifically. And we also, by understanding it better, we obviously will be able to predict it better when we do have to go to a big fire and model it, which you might be wondering, it's 2020, we have fires, it's a very well-known thing, fires have been around forever. Don't we already know everything about wildland fires? Well, it turns out there's a lot of major unanswered questions about exactly how things work. For example, every third grader practically can tell you that a fire will spread faster when the wind blows, but almost nobody can tell you why that happens. I mean, we have general ideas of, oh, heat transfer increases, but we don't know exactly what mechanisms of heat transfer are going, so we can't get putting your thumb exactly on exactly why it happens, why that happens. Same with fire spreading faster uphill, or under what conditions does a fire transition from a surface fire to a crown fire, and why? Why is it that live fuels burn at moisture content of above 100%, but dead fuels won't burn over about 10 or 15%? There's other things that are really also puzzling, like why do some species burn as crown fires and others don't? The very classic example that happens here in Montana is the lodgepole pine, which was kind of a major fuel of the Yellowstone fires in '88. Why do those just burn like crazy, but something like aspen or larch doesn't? We don't have answers to that. We have hypotheses, but we don't have clear answers. Another observation is why some prescribed fires burn only on sunny days and not cloudy days, all else held constant. So in order to get anywhere with wildland fire behavior, to be able to better predict it, we really need to answer some of these questions and have the understanding to get to that point. So just to sort of emphasize how little we actually know, I'm going to talk a couple of different papers, and one is there's a review paper by Andrew Sullivan. So he took all of the different physical and quasi-physical models that were in development up to the point of 2007. And he came up with 19 different physical models, which is kind of surprising and which is telling in itself, because if we really understood the physics of fire spread, why are there 19 different models? Like, you would think that there'd be some consistency, some agreement between them so that there'd be a lot fewer of them. And there's a quote here that's telling us that he said that the identification and formulation of the processes involved in the behavior of wildland fire is problematic. In other words, we don't know, right? So another paper by a guy named Terry Clark also kind of emphasizes this fact and says the science of wildland fires is still in its infancy, and the physics of how they spread is still poorly understood. And he kind of dives down a little bit in here to explain a little bit more why that is. And one of the main challenges to modeling fires is that such models face the enormous task of treating a physical problem where the relevant spatial scales span 6 to 7 orders of magnitude. In other words, we know that fire spreads, that the actual ignition burning of every little pine needle is on the scale of like a millimeter, right? So the ignition and burning happens on millimeter scales and millisecond scales, essentially. But then a fire will spread over a landscape, over tens of miles or tens of kilometers in a single day. So how do you come up with a model that can span that such a wide range of space and time scales? So the overall research goal of our group is to be able to go back and be able to explain exactly how fire spreads. Because once we know how it spreads, we'll know what's important and what's not, so that we can build a physically based, computationally efficient fire spread model. Importantly, that can be used in an operational environment, and that can alleviate the limitations and inaccuracies of the current models. This is important because we have a lot of research models out there, but they take days sometimes to run, or they require a PhD in mechanical engineering to be able to run. We need tools that firefighters can actually use and can run in more real time, in seconds, rather than an hour to days. So in order to get there, our group is doing research into the spread of wildland fires. But historically, spread rate has always been the output, and we haven't gotten very far with that. So what we're doing is we're breaking the spread process down into its components. So really, at its heart, fire spread is a series of ignitions. Right? In order to have any fire, some little clump of fuel must ignite. And that little clump of fuel burns and releases energy at a particular rate. And some of that energy then gets transferred to the unburnt fuel head that has heat. And if enough heat is transferred, enough heat has to be transferred in order for that next little fuel particle to ignite for the fire to spread to continue. So really it's a cycle, what we call the circle of life, that involves these three different processes. But the context of each one of those is also important, right? You can't really drill down too far into, say, the ignition process without kind of keeping in mind the whole idea of what wildland fires is, what the environment's like. So what I want to do is give some very high-level overview of some of the work we're doing in all three phases, but then really drive down into the top phase here, this combustion and energy release. So I'm going to start first with heat transfer. So a lot of what we know about fire comes from the structural fire protection engineering field. I mean, for obvious fire safety reasons, there's a lot of fatalities associated with structural fires, so there's been a lot of investment and a lot of previous research done in these types of fires. But what's different is that the fuels are a very different context than wildland fuels. So in structure fires, they're large surfaces, they're couches, they're walls, they're big pools of gasoline, things like that, which is not the same as a wildland fire. So wildland fuels are characterized by being very fine, right? The fuels that tend to carry fire are the small things, the pine needles, the leaves, the really small branch tips, things that are on the order of a millimeter. And they're discrete particles, meaning they're not big continuous surfaces like bookshelves or couches or walls. They're small little particles that are widely separated by gaps of air, or they're clumps. I mean, big trees, like a clump of trees separated by a gap with another big clump of trees. And another important characteristic is that they're live vegetation. So they're very chemically different than fuels in the structure fire. So going back to the understanding of really what makes fire ticks and understanding how it works is answering the question of what is the heating mechanism responsible for igniting fuel particles. So we've always just assumed it's been radiation because that's really what drives structure fires, and that's the heat transfer mechanism we feel when we stand in front of fire and we feel the heat from it. So that's what we've done all along. However, some very interesting things happen when you take fuel particles that look a little bit differently. So if you take a big-ish surface, like a block of wood, and you stick it in front of a radiant heater with 37 kilowatts per meter squared of heat flux. So that's a pretty good amount of heat flux, like 37 times the sun, if that helps. In about 35 seconds, that block of wood heats up and ignites, no problem. But if you were to take some thinner Excelsior, which is shredded wood, kind of loose wad, the typical size of that is about a millimeter, and stick it in front of that same radiant heat panel, it can sit there forever. In fact, after 5 minutes, it's barely even charred. So, I mean, just to kind of highlight this point, if you can even take a clump of grass and stick it in front of a radiant heater, and it just sits there all day, no problem. Barely gets a sunburn. So, I mean, to kind of help explain this, if we look at the surface temperatures of those two particles, we can kind of see some very telling things. So the red line here is the surface temperature of a bigger fuel particle. It's like, say, 12 millimeters big. And you can see that it heats up quickly and ignites. In this case, we get a little bit higher radiant heat flux, so it ignites in 26 seconds. But this blue line right here is the surface temperature of the thinner particle on the order of 1 millimeter. And you can see that it just sits there and never really gets above 200 degrees Celsius. So it's barely even charring. It may not even touch charring. So it turns out that very thin fuels are really efficient at convective heating and cooling. So all of that radiant heat that's coming in from the panel or a wildland fire, say, is being lost by either natural convection due to just buoyant flows that can induce when things get hot, or forced convection if there's any kind of wind. Because it turns out little particles dangling in the air work just like little cooling fins, like under CPU, which is why my computer fan's going crazy, or the back of your refrigerator or the radiator of your car. They're all very thin little blades, which are almost the same, working the same way as the fuel particles dangling in the air on the tree. So that radiant heat is very easily lost. So if it's not radiation, And it's not conduction, right? Because all of our fuel particles are separated by air, they're not a continuous surface. Plus, conduction is a pretty slow process, relatively speaking. It's got to be convection by flame contact because it's really the only other choice. But it was always been ignored in wildland fire because we always have this mental image of a fire that looks just like this picture, this drawing here in the center, right? Flames are hot, they're buoyant, they rise. So how can the heat possibly, how can the convection and flames possibly go forward and down into the fuel bed if they're hot and want to be vertical? So that was kind of the next step in our next question that we needed to answer. So in order to do that, we did a ton of different flame spread experiments. We used a very unique fuel bed shown in this picture here. So historically, fire spread experiments have always been done in long fuel beds of pine needles or Excelsior, but inevitably, no matter how hard you try, you can't get them perfectly uniform. There's always going to be some flubs in there, no matter what you do. So we needed a very uniform fuel bed in order to sort of start understanding things that's repeatable, controllable, that we can really characterize. So we use these things called cardboard combs. You can see why it's got this spine that we stick in the liquid slots to hold them all up. They're cut by a laser cutter, so we can make any size and shape that we want, essentially. So we did 62 fires in the wind tunnel with a wide variety of fuel beds, tall, widely spaced, thick fuel elements, really trying to kind of explore the range of variables, range of wind speeds. We also did 40 fires on a slope, this big tilting fuel bed that we built in the burn chamber. We saw some very interesting things. So hopefully you don't have any issues with this movie. So here was a video of a fire spreading chorus in the wind tunnel. And immediately what stood out to us was the shape of the flames. We saw very consistent peaks and troughs in the flame structures. And what was really important was that because we used such a uniform fuel bed, it became obvious that these structures were not a result of any uniformity or non-uniformity in the fuel bed. They were actually because of the fire. So it turns out, if you do a wide variety of these, you see kind of the same peak and trough pattern everywhere, but kind of the number of peaks and their spread and their wavelength changes depending on some of the conditions, wind speed, fuel bed density, the fuel loading, stuff like that. But they're pretty consistent from one test to the other. In fact, now that we know what to look for, we see them absolutely everywhere. So here's just some snapshots of some grass fires, some prescribed fires in grass, and you can see the same peaks and troughs all along this line. I mean, they're pretty obvious in this screenshot here, very obvious in that screenshot. So not just grass fires. We saw them in this huge crib fire that we did back behind our facility in the winter. You can see them in ground fires. See them everywhere. So these peaks and trough patterns are actually due to the fluid dynamics of the fire being in a line, right? So you have all of this gas going up, and it has to be replaced with something. You can't just have a whole bunch of stuff going up without anything coming in to replace it. So when the fire's in a line like this, the only really chance it has to replace the air that's going up is to have stuff come down. So that answers the question of, well, how do the flames go down into the unburnt fuel? And it turns out there's also another fluid dynamic instability that's kind of the same reason why candles flicker, that actually pulses the flames forward. And you can see that in this same video here, but with flow tracking. So if you watch down in the trough, you can actually see that not only are the flames coming down, but they're getting pushed farther forward. So, I mean, that's dandy, that's cool, but the question still is like, is that relevant for fire spread, right? So in order to kind of make sure that the fuel particles were responding to this, we instrumented a few of them in our spreading tests. So this graph here shows the red line is the radiant heat flux that was measured with the radiometer that was put right next to a fuel particle in the fuel bed. So the black line is the fuel particle temperature, and the blue line is the temperature of the air right next to that particle. And so you can see like that the radiant heat flux increases pretty slowly ahead of the flame arrival. So by say 100 seconds into this, which is about 40 seconds before the flame's there, the radiant heat flux is up to about 10 kilowatts per meter squared. But the temperature of the particle is only at maybe 100, so it's barely even starting to evaporate the water out of it. And even at 10 kilowatts per meter squared, it would take a big particle minutes, if not much longer, if it ever did ignite at that amount of heat. But if you start zooming in kind of towards the end here, you can see some very interesting patterns. So the blue line, again, is that air temperature. You can see that there's these pulsations of hot gases at very regular intervals that come by that fuel particle. And if you look at that fuel particle temperature, it really responds quite dramatically to those bursts of hot gases. So the fuels tend to stair-step their way up to ignition. So you see it's really driven by that convective heating and not necessarily by that radiant heat. So this is a completely new way of looking at things that we've never really kind of appreciated before. So really it totally like blew our minds and changed the way we approach spread. So because this heat transfer now instead of being dominated by radiation, we're now really focused on convection. So that had some interesting implications for this other, the second mode or second piece of this cycle, right? So what we knew about ignition, again, went back to the structural fire protection engineering field, and all of their studies and what we had known about ignition was all based on radiant heating. But now we know it's convective heating that's driving things. So we've had a whole line of research that I'm not really going to go into just because of time to look at the differences between ignition due to convection and radiation. So one of the other challenges I do want to talk about briefly in understanding ignition and wildland fuel is the problem of live fuels. So I'm going to play a video here to kind of highlight some of the issues that we have with live fuels. So here you're looking at a leaf, a featherbush leaf, which is just a shrub that grows in the southeast very commonly, heated by 800 degrees Celsius air, and the frame rate on this is 1,000 frames per second. So as it's heating, you can kind of see very interesting things, right? Dead fuels, wood, surfaces like that don't do this, right? This is a truly unique thing that live fuels do. So this heating process is not just a simple, gentle heating, but there's something violent that goes on here. Here's another example. So this is some grand fir, which is a common fir tree that grows up in Montana. Oops, this video. So here's a side-by-side. This is the same apparatus. We have 800 degrees C air looking at 1,000 frames per second. But this is a side-by-side of a visual versus an IR footage. So this is, again, the heating up of this fuel. And you can see it's, in just a moment here, very unique. Again, it's not just simply evaporating water. It's releasing water in a very dramatic, explosive way, and also some of the gases that are coming out of there and jetting out of there must be flammable because there are shoots, jets of flame that are coming out of this. So this makes studying live fuels very, very challenging because this is not a phenomenon that we've ever had to deal with before in dead fuels, wood, and anything that can burn in a structure fire, really. So even our most detailed, awesome research models that we have, we always deal with live fuels simply treating them as a thin piece of wet wood, which they are most definitely not. There's a lot of different reasons, structural and chemical, why a live fuel is different than a dead fuel. So structural meaning that they're living, right? So that opens up a different way of water storage than the dead fuel would have, right? So a dead fuel, it dies, all of its cells collapse. So it prevents water from being stored in the actual cells themselves. So the water in a dead fuel is just sort of stored in an interstitial manner. But in a live fuel, the cells are still very much able to store water. So particularly in plants, cell walls are fairly So it almost holds onto the water much like popcorn does. In addition, the many species of live fuels actually also, the whole leaf or the needle itself also has this kind of mechanism, right? As Californians, we know that summers are dry, so there are a lot of plants that really try very, very hard to hold on to whatever little water they can. So they often have very waxy, hard coatings on their surfaces, which again act like the shell of the popcorn kernel. So when that water starts to evaporate, pressure inside the fuel builds, and so until suddenly it can't hold on to it anymore, and everything comes floating out of it. There's also some very important chemical differences between live fuels and, say, wood. Because they're live, they're photosynthesizing. They're producing non-structural carbohydrates during the photosynthesis process. They've got a bunch of fats and proteins, things like that, that can count for like more than half of the dry weight of the fuel. And that's not being accounted for. And that can change daily, let alone over the course of the season. Additionally, there are some very interesting differences between species of live fuels and how much lignin, right? So lignin is a structural component of, say, wood, but also of the needles and the leaves, but it's very expensive. So something like a deciduous plant that's going to drop their leaves or needles at the end of the growing season isn't going to invest a lot in lignin. So perhaps the amount of lignin that is in the plant may help dictate that species to species difference that we see in the So these chemical differences also bring up the point of whether or not moisture content makes sense for a live fuel in general. So moisture content is typically defined as the mass of water divided by the dry mass of the fuel. So in wood, it makes sense because that dry mass of fuel is constant. That piece of wood will be that same piece of wood, relatively speaking, for years, right? It's not changing. But a live fuel is, instead it's growing, it's photosynthesizing, it's making sugars and starches, transporting them all over the plant. So that dry mass is constantly changing. So you can have a change in the moisture content without ever actually changing the amount of water that's in it. So this is a really frustrating thing about live fuels, is that you can't control any of this stuff, but it's all super important. So we need new ways of describing them so that we can actually start to understand them and be able to predict them. So it's one of my frustrating things that I work on. So finally, with the time that I have, I want to talk a little bit more about this, the energy release rate portion of this cycle. So the energy release rate is pretty much a function of the burning rate, the consumption rate of the fuel that's there. As we saw, it's part of that cycle, so it's obviously very important for fire spread, but it also helps us dictate, or to be able to predict the flame zone depth and the fire line intensity, and that's what dictates those peaks and trough patterns. So it's important for calculating the heat transfer part of the puzzle, as well as understanding the whole cycle of spread rate. So an interesting corollary to burning rate is the residence time. So if you've got a certain amount of fuel that's in one spot and you know it burns at a certain rate, then you know how long the flame is there. So that's the flaming residence time. So if you've got discontinuous fuels, like this clumpy grass that we've got here, the residence time kind of provides you a shot clock, if you will, for spread. So if you know that this clump of grass burns out in a certain amount of time, and you know that this clump of grass takes this so much time to ignite, if that residence time is less than the ignition time, your fire won't spread. So it's important for understanding the threshold of fire spread, not just for the whole spread process itself. It is also important for fire effects as well, knowing how long the heat is at a particular point for calculating stem heating, for tree mortality, stuff like that. So our current methods in our operational models don't even bother with burning rate, not even in there. But what is in there is the expression for residence time. It's a very simple just expression that the residence time is 8 times the decade. And this is the same model that we have had since 1969. And it doesn't incorporate any of the things that you would think would matter, like moisture content, like how densely packed the fuel that is, wind, things like that. So we need something better that incorporates all of these different environmental conditions in order to move on, essentially. So much like our spread experiments, we need a very uniform and predictable fuel budget that we can replicate over and over and over again. And we've found that there's this thing called wood cribs that exist in the literature that allow for that very precise control of our fuel bed properties. And they're used very regularly in the fire protection engineering field as ignition sources in many other standardized tests. So there are theory and relations out there to predict the burning rate. So we just wanted to know a simple question: can we just apply that knowledge? And just for perspective, we asked that question in 2012, and I'm still actively doing work with it. So the idea is that it's the same physical processes that govern the burning rate of a crib, a very uniform crib, versus a very complicated wildland. So we weren't the first to come up with this question, right? So I found this picture in our archives of a crib being built back in the 60s in our burn chamber. So this is not a new idea. We're not doing any groundbreaking thought process here, but using these cribs, we've asked a lot of different questions. So this is how I've ended up spending 8 years and have burned more than 1,300 cribs now, which is ridiculous. So these are the questions that we've asked so far. So I mentioned that the crib literature has some expressions for predicting the burning rate. However, they were all developed with very limited test data. So the data set that all of the literature bases their relations on are cribs that were built as perfect cubes. So they all had sticks that were 10 times longer than their thickness and all built with 10 layers. So perfect little cubes. I don't have to tell anybody that wildland fuels are not perfect cubes. So the simple question was, well, what happens if the fuel bed is a different size and shape? Can we break it with different sizes of shapes of fuels? That was the first question. Related to that was, do elevated fuels burn differently than those in the ground? So with something like a crown fire, the fuel in the crown burn differently than fuel on the ground, like surface fire. And then we moved on to other questions, like what happens when you put them in the wind tunnel, because obviously wind is important for fires, wildland fires. Is there a different burning rate for large fires different than small? What's the effective moisture content? And the results of an axisymmetric fire, like a crib, where the air is allowed to come in uniformly all around it, so it's axisymmetric. Can a fire like that be applied to the element of a line fire? What's different? And finally, what happens when you actually control the amount of air that flows into the crib? So all of these questions were answered using the same basic process here. So we built cribs using ponderosa pine sticks with a wide variety of designs, right? So some of them only took an hour to put together. Some of them took up to 15 hours, so almost 2 days of gluing sticks together to build each one of these. We conditioned the cribs to desired moisture content, which usually we let go for about a week. Some of them used thicker sticks, like half-inch. So we wanted to make sure that they really had time to fully equilibrate to their moisture content. And then we'd burn them and measure their mass using 3 different load cells. So picture down here, you can kind of see one of these load cells. So we recorded the mass at 10 hertz, so 10 times a second. So each test, we would put the crib on the weighing platform, measure its initial dry mass, quickly go over, dunk it in alcohol. The idea being to get it to light all uniformly right away. And then we put it back on the weighing platform, measure the wet mass, so how much alcohol we put on there, which usually we give it a good shake and kind of dry it off. So it wasn't much, less than 10% of the overall mass of the fuel bed. And then we'd ignite it and watch it burn. And then we'd clean it up and do it all over again. So every test condition that we ever did, we did at least 3 times. And we were very, very consistent. Variations between tests was almost always less than 10% between tests. So this is what the data from one of these tests look like. You can see initially a flat spot here where we've got that wet mass. How much alcohol is there. When you light it, you get a quick little dip sometimes where you see the alcohol burn off. Then it kind of starts to slowly build up as the sticks ignite. Then you get a region of steady burning sometimes, particularly the thicker the fuel you have, the steadier the burning will be, and then eventually the stick will burn out and you die out. So our first question, as I mentioned, was whether or not this correlations in the literature held for different sizes and shaped fuel beds. So by far the most common one in the literature was the one developed by this guy named Heskestad. So it's kind of a wonky axes on it, but so the y-axis is a scaled burning rate. So it's the burning rate divided by the exposed surface area of the sticks times the stick thickness to the negative half power. and then the x-axis is his porosity factor that he defined. So it's really weird units. It has units of centimeters, which is kind of strange for a porosity, but it does the job. And it is, so the AV is the vent area. So the area of the vents is the area that you'd see if you stand above the crib and look down, just like this picture here on the right. And so the vent area would be the area of all of the holes in it. And AS is the surface area. So it's the ratio of the vent area to the surface area. And that's times by the square root of the stick spacing and the square root of the stick thickness. And so it's really, I think the reason why this correlation became very popular is because it makes it very clear that there's two different regimes of burning. So if you have a very, very dense crib, like this picture here on the left, there's no possible way for air to get into it, to let it burn uniformly. So it's ventilation limited. So you've got like a very, very small porosity crib, and you start slowly expanding porosities, expanding the spacing between them. It starts to breathe better, a little bit more, a little bit better and better as you can keep increasing that porosity. And so that's why you get this function here of burning rate with porosity. But at some point, you're going to space all of the sticks out far enough to where it's not a function of the ventilation anymore. It's not ventilation limited. It's now controlled by what's going on the surfaces and the stick thickness. So it becomes, that scaled burning rate becomes constant. So this satisfies the engineering need to have regimes things. So it's been very popular. But again, it was all based on that very limited data set of cubic little cribs. So what we did was try to break it. So I tried a whole bunch of different crib designs, 4 different stick thicknesses. We tried them all out. We spaced them up off the ground so the air wasn't limited underneath it. We tried 33 different crib designs trying to break this thing, 3 replicas of each. And it turns out it actually does pretty good for most of the cribs that I threw at it. However, there were those guys down there that it really did not do well with. And it unfortunately was with the thinnest fuel element. So 1/16 of an inch is about a millimeter, which is about the size of fuel that we're really concerned with spreading wildfires, right? So that's disappointing. The points that fell down here also tended to be fuel beds that had what I call an aspect ratio, for lack of a better word. So it had a large aspect ratio, meaning that the length of the stick relative to the thickness was very large, which naturally happens the thinner and thinner your fuel gets, but important for wildland fires. So that was disappointing, but turns out that there is a not well-known correlation in the literature that actually works really well for even those really oddball cribs that I threw at it. So this guy Thomas kind of saved the day and came up with a correlation that I think we can use for a pretty wide variety of fuel beds. I think it's not well used because it doesn't have that really nifty zones and a very intuitive sense of what's dense and what's not and how it's going to burn ahead of time. So it works, but it's not as sexy, if you will, as the other one. So along the way, we kind of also noticed that there was not a whole lot of guidance for the effect of the gap below the fuel bed. So that made us ask the question, do elevated fuel beds burn differently than those on the ground? Previous guidance was like, half an inch off the ground is enough that it doesn't make a difference. So we burned a whole bunch of cribs with different heights off the ground to see what happened, and it turns out it matters a lot. So this picture, these set of pictures here are the same crib burned at different heights off the ground. So you see placed directly on the ground on the top left here, it doesn't burn out at all. It burns like as a donut from the outside edges in. That center core barely even chars before it actually gets there. But if you put that same crib up 3 inches off the ground, it burns like gangbusters, very uniformly, consistently all through the way. Burns really fast. So if you start plotting all of these, we did 13 different crib designs where we varied the height to see what would happen. These are the results. So I'm going to point out here what I have a lot of results plotted as normalized burning rate. So normalized burning rate just means it's the burning rate of a particular condition divided by kind of a base case. So for here, the base case is the max burning rate that is seen for the particular gap. Most cases, that was the 3-inch case. So by definition, In most cases, this normalized burning rate should be 1 out here on that higher gap end. This helps us kind of put everything in perspective, right? Because each different crib has very different burning rates. So this, by normalizing it, you can develop a plot on one graph so that you can kind of see the trends. So in general, you need to, in order to burn a crib without restricting the ventilation into it, put it up off the ground by at least 3 inches. So that also has important implications for ground fires versus surface fires, right? You're going to get a very different burning rate for a fuel bed, the same fuel bed that's on the ground versus up in the air. And that burning rate can be hugely different. I mean, in some of these cases, it was a tenth of what it could be. So it turns out that this discrepancy is very important the bigger that aspect ratio gets again. So for cribs that have wide fuel beds, long sticks relative to the thickness, this becomes very important, which again, for wildland fires, this should be important. So this is a pretty interesting key part of the puzzle here. So I'm going to kind of just skip over the wind tunnel bit and talk a little bit about a question that came up that while we were watching some fires, which I'll show you in just a second. What is different between a large fire and a small fire? Do they burn the same? So this question is basically, so if you have a fuel bed burning, say, as a campfire, and you can watch it, observe its burning rate, does that same fuel bed burn the same way as a campfire as it does a huge ass fire that looks like this? Seems that may not necessarily be the case, that there are some other things that go on in big fires that can have feedback mechanisms back to change the way things burn. Like these big fires are unpredictable for a reason. Why? So this is one of the videos that we saw that kind of like started our thinking of maybe something really has to be different. And maybe that something is the burning rate. So this is a prescribed fire that happened up in Idaho. And you can, I don't know how well you can hear in the background, but there's a helicopter that's going through and doing some ignitions. So it's a fairly long video, so I'm going to do some fast forwarding here. Oops, maybe not. Hopefully this works. There we go. So as we go along, you can see at first a fire spread will come, a surface fire will come through. Get some smoke, helicopters gone by. Maybe I'll let this play a little bit. So here's about where the surface fire comes through. It's nothing terribly exciting. But you know, fairly tame little surface fire. Kind of consumes some things. It lingers in the dust for a little bit. Fast forward a little more. And then it finds that jackpot of logs down over by the other kind of weird looking tripod thing over there. It's one of our sensors. But generally, it kind of looks like most of that surface fuel has been consumed. Where the fire's still burning in some of the heavier, down weight stuff. Some time goes by. I mean, we're 3 minutes into this video. Some of the bigger stuff is still kind of burning a little. That's annoying. Sorry. So after a little while, that jackpot is still burning, but that surface fuel is out mostly. A few minutes later, same deal. Not much is happening. Although you start to see now, it seems like the wind has picked up a little bit, and the fire is starting to climb up the trees just a little. But it seems like the wind might be picking up a little bit. Fast forward a little bit more. It's getting windier. Getting even windier. wind just keeps picking up. Now it started to pull the insulation off of the camera that we're looking at. And then suddenly things started lighting on fire again. Things that you thought were out are now burning well. In fact, we go just a little later, say here, everything is on fire again. Everything's on fire again. And you thought it was out. So this kind of like made us start to think that large fires do something different than small fires. So, you know, one of the things, when you get really bad, big, large fires, they're on the worst possible days, right? Really low humidity, so fuel moisture is really far down. So instead of just a simple little like surface fire that spreads through those fine fuels that are just on the surface, you start getting more involved in the bigger, heavier stuff, like dust stuff. So instead of a line fire, suddenly you have like an area that's on fire. So the bigger and bigger the area gets, the wider and wider the plume above that fire gets. And so really wide plumes, turns out, you can't pull in a lot of fresh air as they go. So the wide plumes can be very, very tall plumes. So we were wondering if those really tall plumes ended up having a feedback with what was going on the ground. So obviously, one cannot make this happen naturally, on demand, safely. So what we had to do was mimic that in the lab. So to do that, we used a simple chimney and tested the same little wood cribs that we've been burning with different chimney heights to see what would happen. So our usual procedure, dried them out, ignited them, tried 17 different crib designs with a wide variety of chimney heights. There's a little video here that compares side by side of the same crib in a chimney and not outside the chimney. I might fast forward through this a little bit in the interest of time. But you see it ignites. We have to ignite the crib outside of the chimney and then push it in because of the fuel vapors. But as soon as it's pulled in, you can see that something dramatic starts to happen. And if you can hear it, you can hear there's quite a bit of airflow that starts getting sucked into the chimney. So you just kind of move it along a little further into the burning. You can see that like the same crib burns very differently outside of the chimney than it does inside of the chimney. This turns out has a huge effect on the actual burning rate. So here again, I'm looking at the normalized burning rate. So I considered my base case to be the no chimney case. So by definition, chimney height of 0 is a normalized burning rate of 1. But by doing this, you can see that some of those crib designs almost tripled their burning rate by putting under a chimney with a 12-foot chimney. Some of them less dramatic than others, but so of the 17 crib designs I tested, 11 of them did this, where the taller the chimney, the higher the burning rate. So here's the other 5, right? Some of them less dramatic, that's why they're on the second spot. But there were 6 that didn't. Like, it seems like my whole research goal is to break rules and break correlations and break the expected findings, and this is another place where I did. So for some reason, these crib designs, for short little chimneys, you get it to increase the burning rate, but as the taller and taller the chimney got, the slower and slower a lot of them burned. And some of them burned even way slower than it did without the chimney. So, okay, why the increase? So as the chimney height is increased, or as the plume gets taller and taller, there's a taller column of hot gases sitting on top of the fire, which means that hot gases are less dense, which means the hydrostatic pressure of the fuel bed decreases, meaning there is a bigger pressure difference between the top of the plume or within the chimney versus the ambient air, which induces a flow down at the ground because there's nowhere else for it to go in, right? Because the plume is restricting airflow. So you're inducing a fire wind on the fuel bed itself. So you're ventilating the fuel bed like mad. And so that increased ventilation is especially important the denser the fuel bed is, right? Because there are some that are ventilation limited, meaning they can't breathe well enough until you force a bunch of air into it. So it leans those out, leans those fuel air mixtures out, so they burn better. important, even if the crib isn't ventilation limited, because of char oxidation. If you ever play with your campfire and you blow on the coals, you know that you burn a lot brighter and hotter, you blow up the ventilation. That's char oxidation. And that also can promote flaming over smoldering, right? So now you're involving fuels that weren't burning before in flaming, more fuels in flaming, and you're increasing the fuel consumption rate. So you're totally changing the fire behavior that way. So the decrease is a little bit more, harder to understand. If you start looking at pictures side by side, you can see that a lot of times the perimeter is not burning well. It's almost like it's cooled. In fact, that was very dramatic in some cases. In fact, I burned this crib 6 times and it looked identical every single time. And if you were to zoom in on the crib and look at what's going on with the flame and the gases, you can see that it's not burning. It's almost like it's over ventilating and blowing all of the gases out of the fuel bed and burning disconnected with the fuel bed. So you're not getting that heat feedback that drives the burning rate. So it turns out the cribs that decreased their burning rate were all very short ones, but they all had a small non-dimensional heat release rate, or Q star. So for the engineers listening, the Q star is basically a free number. And it compares the buoyant advection, so the advection, the current air currents that are due to buoyancy, it compares that to the fuel flow rate, so how fast the gases are coming out of the fuel bed. And it turns out when Q star is low, those two velocities are comparable, meaning that everything is flowing away before it has a chance to burn. But what's interesting is that may actually help us provide, or it actually explains a possible upper limit to this behavior. I mean, fires can keep getting bigger and bigger, but they don't. There has to be an upper limit on that behavior at some point, right? You can't just keep increasing its burning rate indefinitely. So, very, very briefly, I want to talk about my challenge of answering the question of what's the effect of moisture content. Did the same procedure. We wanted to know if ventilation affects things, so we did it inside and outside of the chimney, 7 crib designs, 3 replicates. And the challenge, as I always seem to find, are things that break my expectations, and moisture content was no exception. So here's the normalized burning rate for the different moisture contents for the different cribs. Each column is a different moisture content. So by definition, or my base case is the dry case, right? So based on where that red line is, you can see that adding a little moisture content actually can make your fuel bed burn faster, which is not what you would expect. And that mostly goes away when you put it in the chimney and put some ventilation on it, but not always. I will explain this more if we've got time for questions, but the one last thing that I'm working on right now is what happens when you actually control the amount of air in the crib, right? So the chimney, you were ventilating the crib, but it was sort of by a feedback mechanism that you can't control. So one of the things we're doing right now is putting the cribs in this pressurized box, where we put the crib at the top of the box and control the flow rate of air into it right now. And we're in the middle of doing all these experiments, but hopefully that will help us really tease and decouple the effect of the ventilation from the chimney. So I'm out of time, so I think I will stop and answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Sara. And I thank you all to all the participants who soldiered through the audio. I know that was an incredible challenge for Sara that she had no control over with her government computer. So I will note very quickly that Michael has put the link to the discussion in the Zoom chat here. So please, at 4 o'clock, we'll go ahead and move over there. And so all the questions that folks have asked in Q&A, we'll just go ahead and bring over with us. I will note that there's a quick question maybe that you can answer, Sara. Your prescribed fire video, Petronella asks if that video is available online anywhere.
We don't have it up for download, but I'm happy to share it. If you want to email me, I can set it up in a Google Drive or something for you.
Okay. And I see we have a few other questions, and for folks that are able to, we will go ahead and move now over to the discussion room and answer those questions in the discussion room. So please go ahead and everyone head over to the discussion room. We'll continue this with Sara. Thank you so much, Sara.
Thank you. All right. I closed my email in an attempt to, uh, oh, here's the discussion. Okay, got it.
Yep.
Okay, I will see you there.